So in today's tutorial, we'll be looking at how to contain fire within a shape. We'll also be looking at how to control where and when the mesh burns, starting, stopping and erasing the smoke, and we will be using dynamic paint for some of that. We'll also be looking at how to control the look of the fire, and that's done with the compositor. So the first thing I'd like to do is explain that we are using the internal renderer and not Cycles for this, and that's because Cycles doesn't currently have a way to render volumes. And the other thing I'd like to explain is how this effect differs from other effects you may have seen of fire in Blender. And that's because most of the other tutorials I've seen have objects that are on fire, and so flame is coming off them, but this tutorial is actually about having an object that's made of fire, so it's actually the volume that makes up the object is going to be filled with fire rather than just fire coming off it, although we will have a bit of that anyway. So the first thing we need to do when dealing with smoke, and even though we're doing fire, it's the smoke simulator that we use to create it. And the first thing we're going to do is add a domain. So Shift A, add a cube, and I'm immediately going to change its display mode to wire so we can see through it, because we aren't actually going to need to see its solid faces. And then I'm just going to make sure our 3D text is sitting within it. We don't need any space underneath really, but we may need a bit of headroom just so the flame can rise up a bit. And make sure it also fits in the other views. So I've added this domain on layer 1, and I'm going to press Ctrl A, and we're going to apply the rotation and the scale. I'm not sure this makes a huge amount of difference, but it's always a good idea to do it. Now you can see here I've got my text object, and it's still in its editable form. And this is going to be the object that emits the smoke particles. But what we actually need to do is have a way of containing the particles so they don't travel too far, otherwise we'll lose the shape of the text. And this is where it becomes a bit complicated, because we're doing a smoke simulation, and so we're going to be inputting values, and then we're going to ask Blender to simulate the effect of the fire, and yet we also want to have a certain amount of control over the fire. And that's kind of going against the simulation, because there's a fine line between how much influence we can have and how realistic the simulation could then be, because the more we influence it, the less realistic it's going to be. But what we need is a way of containing it. And so what I'm going to do is move this text to layer 2, so M and then 2. I'm then going to convert it with Alt-C, so we're going to convert to a mesh. I'm then going to tab into edit mode, select everything and press W and then remove doubles. You can see we've removed 186 vertices there. And what I'm then going to do is add a modifier, and it's going to be a remesh modifier. And I'm just going to uncheck remove disconnected pieces so we can bring back the other piece of the text, and then up our levels to about 5. And I'm not at this point going to explain what the remesh modifier does, because it's only later on that we're actually going to see the effects of it. But it's basically because we're going to be using dynamic paint and we're going to be using weights, so we need an even distribution of vertices, and this is what remesh does. So I'm then going to Shift D and duplicate my text and move it to layer 0, and that's going to be our spare one just in case we need it again. And then on this one I'm just going to apply our modifier, and if we go into edit mode we can see we have a nice even grid of vertices. So what I'm then going to do is Shift D and move this back to layer 1, and then we're going to go to layer 1 so we can see our domain again, and then I'm going to press Shift 2 to bring back our other layer. So at the minute we have two text objects which are exactly the same on top of each other, and with the text object on layer 1 still selected, I'm going to tab into edit mode, I'm going to select everything, and then I'm going to press Alt S, and what we can see is that we have started the shrink and flatten tool, and as I move my cursor up and down we're able to expand the text. And so what I'm going to do is hold Shift so we can refine our movements. I'm going to expand it up to about here, and what we can see is we have our original text is this black outline, and then we've got this second text which is going to be our container, which is slightly bigger. So what we've done is created an area that the fire particles can exist in. It's going to be emitted from this central text and contained by this outer text. And I don't think it matters too much that we've got intersecting pieces here. So what I'm going to do is tab out of edit mode, And we're now in a position to start setting up our smoke settings. So over on the Physics tab with our cage selected, this is what I'm going to be calling it, our cage which is holding the particles in place. I'm going to click Smoke and then Collision, and we can leave that setting as it is. And I'm actually going to come out of wire mode, and again I'm going to set the display type to wire so we can see inside it. We're going to click our original text, Smoke. This is going to be a flow because we want it to generate particles. We're going to change the flow type from smoke to fire. If you wanted, you could do fire and smoke, but for this I am just doing the fire because that's all we're going to see in the render. And what I want to do is change this surface value to 1. And the surface value says the distance from the mesh surface to emit smoke. So what we're doing is reducing that number a bit and saying we want the smoke particles to be generated quite close to the surface of this text. And that's to make sure we are not emitting particles outside of this cage. We want to make sure we're only emitting particles in this gap. So now we've got one more smoke setting to do, and that is on the domain. So again, I've clicked our domain object, smoke domain, and the first thing we're going to do is change the resolution, and currently it's at 32. Now, unlike some of the other simulations which also use a domain and have a resolution, like the fluid simulation, normally you would think that the more divisions you give it, the smoother the result and the better it will look. And to a certain extent that's still true. But what this mainly does is control the size of our flame. And so if we give it a larger value, we'll start being able to see smaller flames. And if we reduce it, we'll see bigger flames. And this can change the look of the simulation by quite a lot. So if you fine-tuned a lot of these other values and then you change the resolution, you'll find that these other values then have to be fine-tuned again to fit the new resolution. So I found the best thing to do is actually choose the resolution you're going to use right from the start. So for this, I'm going to set mine to 100. I could probably go higher, but again, this is to do with the size of the flame I want, not really to do with the quality. So I know this will produce the right size of flame for how I want it. The other settings we're going to do is border collisions. At the minute, the smoke will be able to escape out from the domain, and I don't really want that, so we're going to collide all, and I'm just going to make our domain a bit bigger, and then again Control A, rotation and scale. I'm also going to turn on dissolve, and I'm going to turn down the time. Now I'm not really sure if this setting actually affects what we're doing, because we are just using fire and not smoke, but I turned it on anyway, because it does say that it will try and fade out the smoke a bit quicker, and that's why I reduced the time as well. But I'm not really sure if this does actually affect us or not. And so now we are ready to give a little test just to make sure everything is working. So what I'm going to do is just press Alt A, and what we can see is our fire is being generated and it's being trapped in our text. Now we seem to have a bit escaping here, and I've had this happen before and I'm not really sure what causes it. I'm not sure if there's something wrong with the remesh mesh that was generated, but I don't think it matters too much. But the point is, it is actually working. We are emitting fire and it's being trapped within our container as we want. So it's at this point I want to fine tune a few settings that we've used for the fire now that we've seen that it's working. One thing I want to do is make it a bit faster. Although we can't see it when we play back in the viewport because it's going to be a bit slower, I do know that this is still a little bit slow, so I'm just going to put up to 0.8. I'm also going to increase the vorticity, and I'm going to double it so it's at 1. And then I'm going to reduce the minimum temperature of the flames, that's the ignition value, to 0.5, and I'm going to leave the maximum at 1.75. Now, just to explain what this ignition does, it basically allows for slightly cooler fire. And what we find is the fire will be generated and then the simulation will start to heat up. And when it heats up, the colours of the simulation, and that's when we render it, start to get very bright because the heat has got very intense. So what I'm trying to do is cool the simulation down a bit so we get a better look when we render it. And that's also why I increased the vorticity, because as we reduce the temperature, we get slightly less movement in the flame, and the vorticity turns that movement up again. But we're still keeping the simulation slightly cooler. And the vorticity is how much the flame kind of twists and turns, and it will give kind of a rolling effect to the flame, so it's not just static. So the next thing we can do now that we've got quite a few of our smoke settings set up is actually see how it looks in the render, because it's only really in the render that we're going to understand if our simulation is working as we want or not. So what I'm going to do is, selecting our cage, I'm going to press Ctrl H, and that means it won't be visible in the render because it is just a collision cage. And I'm also going to select our original text and also press Ctrl H on that. And you may be thinking, why would you not want to render the text? Well, the text is only emitting the fire, and it's actually the domain that is going to be rendered and have the volume material. So what I'll do is go over to the World tab, New World. I'm going to turn on Environment Lighting, and at 50% I'm just going to give it a render, and here we can see our brilliant result. And obviously it's not quite what we want, and this is what a lot of people come up against. They think, well, I've just simulated all this fire and all I'm seeing is a solid block. And that's because we need to tell the domain that it is no longer simply a cube which will render solidly. We need to tell it that it's going to be a volume that needs to be able to render fire. So I'm going to do a new material, and it's going to be volume. And the first thing I'm going to do is turn our density all the way down to 0. And you can see our preview has disappeared. And again, you may be thinking, why have you just made it so it's invisible? Well, this density value here is kind of a base setting. So it's basically saying this is the minimum density of your object. And obviously, we don't want it to have a minimum density. We want all the density to be controlled by the fire particles. If we gave this a minimum density, then when we rendered, we would still see a slight cube without fire inside. And that's not what we want. We only want the fire. So we want to reduce any minimum density it's going to have. So I'm then going to go over to the Texture tab, do a new texture, because this is going to be how we add in the information of the fire. The texture type is going to be voxel data, and it's right here at the top. And on the voxel data tab, although you may be thinking, well, earlier on we changed our smoke option so it was just fire, but this is the actual format, so we are going to leave it as smoke because we are using Blender's smoke system. Our domain object, well, that's cube, and that's where it's going to look for the simulation data. But the source, so within that simulation data, we now just want the flame. And you can see immediately something has appeared in our preview up here. But what we now need to say is, how do we want to use this simulation data? And so I'm going to tick density, because remember we turned off all our base density, and we want all our density to be controlled by the simulation data. And I'm also going to turn on the amount of emission, and this over here is the emission color. So we're going to turn both of those on and give it a quick render. And you can see we've got beautiful pink smoke, which isn't quite what we want. So what we need to do, and it is good that we are seeing something, so again we are a step closer to our goal. We are seeing the smoke being rendered properly. But what we're going to do is, in the Colors tab, we're going to check Ramp, and we're going to start adding in our colours of how we want the fire to look. And I've actually already got these colours saved in a separate Blender file off screen, and that's because it can be very difficult to find the right mix. And so these colours are basically taken from some of the examples of the developer who created the smoke system. I think his name is Mika. And he's got some test files on his website, and I've just looked at the colour values that he's used and maybe just tweak them slightly. I want to basically say it's based on his values. So I am just going to copy over some colours and then we're going to go through them. So I've copied over those colours, and let's go through them now. We've got a very light blue, and just I'm just going to hover over just so if you want to note down these colour values, you can get the exact same colour that I'm using. And this is actually pretty transparent, but it'll work as a gradient to the next colour. The next colour is a slightly transparent orangey colour, and that's going to make up the main colour of our flame. And the next one is like a reddish browny colour, and it's quite dark. And the last one is black, and it's completely transparent. And you'll notice that I've moved them onto specific points in the colour ramp area here. And what this is basically going to do is map these colours onto different parts of the flame. And so you can think about this as being the very start of the flame when it just gets emitted, and the outer edges of the flame are going to be this darker colour. And the reason why I've copied them over and not done them manually is that I found it's very difficult to fine tune these colours, and any slight variation can really vary the colour of your render a lot. It's really best to work off something as a base and then fine tune it as you need it. So what I'm going to do is give that a render and see how it looks. So we are getting something, it's at least a different colour, but it's not looking quite right, and that's to do with the density. Now, I don't want to adjust this base density, but we do have this density scale, and it says a multiplier for the material's density. So if it's not dense enough, we can basically say, put this value to 2 and make it twice as dense. What we're actually going to do is set it to 5, so it's 5 times as dense as it was. I will just render it again, and you can see it's very, very grainy, and that's to do with the step size. You can think of it as only taking some data from the simulation. If you put it to a lower value, such as 0.015, then it's going to look a smaller distance from every point in the simulation, and so it should give a better result. So let's give that a render, and you can see we're getting something a bit better. But what I'm going to do is just increase the intensity of the emission, so I want to make it a bit brighter. So I'm going to set that to 3, and we're now getting something that's quite a bit brighter, but we're not getting is enough detail yet. Now that we can see it, we can go back and fine tune the resolution of our domain. And I don't mean the resolution up here, but I mean smoke high resolution. So I'm going to turn on high resolution smoke. We want to smooth the emitter, just in case these aren't on by default. And I also want to show high resolution in the viewport. And I'm also going to change the noise method. And the noise method is how it kind of creates the little ripples in the smoke. And I've just found that changing this to FFT gives a slightly better result. I don't know how it's different, I just know it looks slightly better. And I also want to put on adaptive domain, and adaptive domain is basically an optimization, and we're going to see that active in the viewport in a minute. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and press Alt A, and we can see this box here, and it's slightly smaller than our domain, but it's getting bigger, and that's because adaptive domain is saying, well, we're not going to use the whole space of the domain because we don't need to yet, so we're just going to use a smaller area and expand as we need to. And that's so it's not quite doing as many calculations as it was before. Now, I don't need it going all the way through, so I'm going to press Escape. I'm just going to pick a place to render. And what I'm going to do is change my transparent setting to Sky so we can get a black background on our flame. And I will just change that to black. Now, at the minute, we're still not getting a great result. So what I'm going to do is actually scale up. So I'm just going to bring back the camera I'm using and selecting everything. I'm going to press S and just scale up so that the domain is almost the width of our grid. And then, like before, I'm going to go through and apply the rotation in the scale so we can see the scale is off at the minute. And then rebake that and see if our result is any better. So scaling it up for some reason does make a difference, and I don't really know why, but I did find that the result was just getting better as I scaled it up more. And so here we can see the result of our simulation. Now what you may be thinking is that this doesn't really look like fire, and our material doesn't look very good, and I'd agree, but with this material we're actually going to be controlling the look of the fire in the compositor, and I'm not actually worried at all about the way it looks at the minute, because this just gives us a starting point, and it gives us a better starting point than the pigment did, because it's giving us a range of colours to play with. So we're getting that blue that we set, that very faint blue, and at the outer edges we're getting that darker red, and we're getting yellows as well. And this gives us a great range of colours that we can play with once we're in the compositor. So don't worry too much that it looks, well, a bit weird at the minute. But what I don't want is every part of the text burning at once. I want to create some kind of randomness, and again this technique is borrowed from the guy who developed the smoke system. And what we're going to be doing is adding an option to the fire. Under Smoke Flow Advanced, we can see we've got the option to use a texture. And this basically controls the emission strength of the smoke. So we can apply a texture and say some parts are going to have full fire and some parts are not. And if we then animated that texture, we could get varying results, and the fire would appear at some points and disappear and then start burning again. So if we look in here, we've only got that texture that we used for the smoke simulation. We don't want to use that. So I'm going to create a new material. And remember, this text isn't actually rendering, so this material here doesn't actually matter, and the only reason I'm creating it is as a place to store this texture. So remember, it's not rendering, so I'm going to uncheck that. We're going to leave it at clouds, and the setting's going to change. I'm going to change it to 0.5 with depth of 3, and I'm also going to change the type of clouds to Voronoi F1, and I've just found it gives a bit of a better result. But the colours aren't quite too good at the minute. So again, we're going to use a ramp, and I'm going to bring this one in over to here, darken it down, then bring in this one to lighten it up again. And I'm just going to make sure that depth is at 3 so we get a bit more detail. And what we're creating is kind of a cloudy look, so that these black parts aren't going to be having fire appearing, but these white parts are. So we'll go back to the simulation settings, and we've now got an extra texture, texture 001, and I'm going to change the mapping to UV. We don't currently have a UV map, so I'm quickly going to tab into edit mode, and then U, and then Smart UV Project, and just use the defaults. And if we don't really need to see it, but you know, it's just done it automatically, and we can now choose the UV map. And the reason why I've done that, I've just found it gives a slightly better result than using generated, but if we were to render it right now, we wouldn't actually see any difference. And that's because we need to rebake our fire simulation. And that is because this is affecting how the fire is emitted and not how it's rendered. So you do have to re-simulate. And now you can see we're getting a very patchy result, and it almost looks like paper that's burning, and the edges are slightly darker thanks to our colour ramp, but this wouldn't look too good if it was just solid. And I did say we were going to animate that texture, and we can animate it using this offset value. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the simulation, and so to animate this value I'm just going to press I while my cursor is over it to insert a keyframe. We're then going to go to the end of the animation, set this to 4, and press I again. And so what this does is basically just offsets that texture, and because we're using a procedural texture, and that means it's a texture that's generated by an equation, it's not going to have any edges, and that means we can offset this almost indefinitely and we won't see any edges because it'll just start generating new texture. So again, now that we've animated this value, we have to rebake the animation to see the new results. But I'm not going to do that quite yet, because you don't really see the effect of this offset value until you actually render out the animation. So we're actually going to move on to the next part of the tutorial, and that's using the dynamic paint, which I mentioned earlier. Now what I'm going to do is just turn off high resolution smoke for the minute, because we're going to be rebaking it quite a bit, and I want to have a slightly faster result. So I'm just going to let that go through a bit, and then I'll explain what we're doing. Basically, our texture is just starting to burn straight away, but I want a way to control when the text starts to burn, and I actually want it to start burning from the bottom to the top, and that's for no other reason than that's how I imagined it happening. And if we go back to our fire settings, we can see we've got a vertex group here, and it says name of vertex group which determines the surface emission rate. So we're not only going to use the texture to control the emission rate, but we can actually use a vertex group as well. And so we're going to use dynamic paint to generate that vertex group. So what I'm going to do is just Shift 3 to enable layer 3, and then I'm going to add another cube, and like last time, I'm going to set it to wire, and then I'm going to make sure it can fit over our whole text. And I'm just going to disable layer 1 so we can see this a bit better. I'm just going to scale it up like before. So if you've used dynamic paint before, you know it's over in the physics panel, and this is going to be our dynamic brush, this box we've just made, because it's going to draw onto our text. So I'm going to enable dynamic paint. This is going to be a brush, and the only thing we're going to change is the dynamic paint source, and I'm going to change this to proximity. And what we'll see later on is that creates a softer edge, and so we can have a slight gradient as to where the fire is appearing rather than the really sharp edge. So I'll then do the canvas. So I'm going to minimize our smoke settings, enable dynamic paint. It's going to be a canvas. We are going to use a Vertex Group with anti-aliasing, but instead of painting, we're going to be adding weight. And then under output, we just need to create that Vertex Group that we're going to be using. And so what I'm going to do is move this below our text. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the animation and press I and location, and then I'm going to go to about frame 34, move our box up and press I and then location. So now our box is moving, and see what you can see is that our dynamic paint is painting onto the text, and like I said, it's creating a slight gradient, so we're getting this green line rather than it just being solid red and solid blue. But what we need to do is connect the dynamic paint to the smoke simulation. So I'll re-enable layer 1 where our fire is, I'll select our text, and under the smoke flow advanced, I'm going to use our weight group that our dynamic paint is generating. So I'm then going to go back to the beginning, press Alt A, and you'll notice it's still not doing it, and that's because our modifiers are in the wrong order. So if we go over to the Modifiers tab, we can see we've got Smoke and then Dynamic Paint. But we're using the Dynamic Paint to drive the emission of the smoke. But if you didn't know, the Modifier stack gets evaluated in the order from top to bottom. So the smoke is running, and then the Dynamic Paint is running. But what we need to do is have the Dynamic Paint run, generate that Vertex Group, and then feed it into the smoke simulator. So I'm just going to press the down arrow so that Dynamic Paint evaluates first. And when we press Alt A, we can see that the smoke is now only appearing once the mesh has been painted red. So now that we've got our fire appearing, we now need to work out a way to get it to disappear, or at least that's the effect I wanted. I am just going to, again, hide layer 1, just because the fire can get in the way a bit. And then I'm going to duplicate our dynamic paintbrush and move it directly below. And then parent it, so I've shift selected the other box and press Ctrl P. And then we want to set the parent to object and want to keep the transform. And what I'm then going to do is go to where the keyframes are for the motion. This doesn't need keyframes, so we're going to clear them. So now when we move back, the box is following. So I'm then going to go to frame 100, and we're still keyframing this original box. We're going to set a keyframe for location, and then at frame 126, we're going to move it up. So this second box is now covering the text, and I'm going to put in another keyframe for the location. So you've got the box covering it, and then the other box is covering it. And this second box is going to have slightly different dynamic paint settings. Just one setting, it's going to erase the paint. And so I'm going to play through. Our fire appears. I'm going to have a good period where we see the fire, and then it erases. So I'm just going to bring back layer 1 and bake that. So if we go through, we can see it appears bottom to top, and then it disappears again. So if I just render this well, we can still see our dynamic paint boxes. So I'm going to select both of them and press Ctrl H again, and then render. And we can see our fire is disappearing. So what I'm going to do, now that we're nearing the end, I'm going to re-enable our high resolution smoke. And again, I'm going to bake it. There is a lot of baking involved when you're doing smoke simulations. So I'm going to let that run through again. So I have now baked the high resolution fire again. Before we were just playing it through the timeline and it would bake. This time I did actually use the slightly more reliable method of using the smoke cache. So I just pressed this button which said bake. It now says free bake because it's already got a bake stored, and it means we can play through without it having to recalculate. Now, one thing I also changed on the fire was the flame burn rate to be set to 10 to make the flame even stronger. And we have got a few problems in that the fire does seem to be getting out of our collision mesh a bit, and I haven't really found the solution to that. I don't always get it happening, but I believe it's something to do with the cage mesh. And if I just go into the local view by pressing / and I'll just set it back to solid, I think where you can see these seams, there's a slight darker line around the edges, and I believe that could be solved by just cutting and turning them into triangles and going around the edges. But I'm not going to bother because it doesn't make too much of a difference and it does look alright when it renders. But one thing that is also slightly problematic is that when our paint is getting erased, when the second box starts to cover up the text, what's actually happening is it's telling the smoke simulation to not burn anymore. But what it's not doing is getting rid of the fire that's already there. And so what we see is, if I were to render this frame, we might expect that the lower half would be a lot fainter, and that's what we had before when we weren't using the high resolution smoke. But if we do render, we see that all the smoke, or I should say fire, is visible, and that's a bit problematic. So what I'm also going to do is go back to the beginning, and I'm going to duplicate this second dynamic paintbrush, the one that's the eraser. So I'm going to press Shift-D and just leave it in place, and I'm going to tab into edit mode, go into face select mode, invert the selection with Ctrl-I, so we're selecting everything apart from that top face, press delete, and then faces. So we're left with this individual face at the top. I'm then going to go into the physics panel and remove the dynamic paint and set this to be a smoke object, and it's going to be a flow object, but this time it's going to be outflow. So what this should do is pretty much erase most of the smoke. So we've got this box which is stopping the burning from continuing, and we've got this plane which is going to erase the fire that's already been emitted. But if we did it at the minute, we'd have a completely straight line of the fire disappearing, and that would look a bit strange. So to make it look a bit more natural, we're going to do a few things to alter the properties of this plane. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a subdivision surface. I'm going to set it to simple, so we can see it's just doing simple subdivisions, and I'm going to turn that up a bit. And I'm then going to add a wave modifier, and I'm just going to offset this value a bit so we can see it in action. And the wave modifier, well, it creates a wave and it's creating ripples coming out from the center. So I'm just going to change a few properties such as the height, and what we're trying to basically do is break up this straight edge. So you can see we're getting it quite jagged at the minute, which is good, that's what we want. And what I'm going to do is set this offset value back to 0 and insert a keyframe, and then I'm going to go to the end of the timeline and set this to 50 and insert another keyframe. So as it rises up, we can see it's changing its shape, and it's not going to be a completely straight line, which is what we want. And just to make this a bit less jagged, I'm first going to up this so it's a bit more of an extreme effect. And then we're going to add another subsurf modifier. But this time we're going to set it to be the regular view, and it's just smoothing it out a bit. And then we're going to move the smoke to the bottom, because otherwise the smoke won't take into account these other modifiers. So then, hopefully just one final time, I'm going to rebake. So now that's finished, and if I scroll through, we can see our objects come up, and this time we're seeing a lot less fire. Now we're still seeing some, and I'm not really sure why. Maybe if I made this more solid, it would have a greater chance of erasing, but once we get to the top, if I render it now, we're seeing that a lot of the fire is now fading out, and it's using those darker colours from our colour ramp to texture it. So this object that we made, it may not be completely necessary, but I did find it useful in erasing the smoke a bit more efficiently. And so what I'm going to do is pick a good frame somewhere around here and render it one final time. Now we're going to be ready to move on to the compositing and get that final colour. So I'm just going to go to the compositor, and I'm just going to use nodes and enable backdrop, and then holding Shift and Control, I'm then going to click this node, and what that does is just create a viewer node automatically, and we can now see our text in the background. Now the first thing we're going to do is add an RGB curves node, because effectively what we're doing is colour correction. And it's at this point that you really have to decide what type of fire you're looking for, because I had a very specific type of fire and a very specific colour I was looking for, so I knew what I was working towards. And it can be a bit difficult to know when you're finished if you don't really know what your target is. So you may very well be happy with the way the fire looks now, and if this is what you want, that's great. But if you don't, try and figure out what type of colours you want to introduce, then you know if what you're doing in the compositor is getting towards that goal or not. So what I'm going to do, just on the main colour, I'm going to drag this curve and add a few points to try and darken it down a bit. And that was affecting the whole colour channel, but now I'm just going to affect the red, and what I want to do is increase the red. So I'm just going to add another couple of points, boost the colour, and then I want to reduce the amount of green in the image, so I'm just going to reduce the green, maybe not that much, and because it's getting a bit blue, I'm also going to reduce the blue a bit. So now it's a good point to see whether this colour correction we've just done has been helpful or not, and a good way of doing that is just selecting this node and pressing M, we can disable it. So this is what it looked like before, and pressing M again to unmute, I can say that, yep, that's getting towards something that I'm happy with. Just make sure that's going out to the composite as well. I'm going to add a colour mix node, and then a filter blur node, and I'm going to plug in our blur node. And what I want to do is set this to overlay, and then I'm going to turn on relative on the blur and give a small blur. And what we're doing is overlaying the blur over the original image. So we're overlaying a blurred version over the non-blurred version, and that's a bit too strong, so I'm probably going to turn that down to 0.5. Again, if we press M over the node, we can see what that's doing. And one final thing I'm going to do, just to get that final colour that I'm looking for, is add a colour balance node. And I know that I want quite a reddish and almost introducing a bit of pink into the flame. So just on the lift, on this left circle, I'm just going to move the point over a bit into the pink. So if I went really extreme, you could see the effect. I think that's a bit too much. And if I disable that, I can toggle between, and yeah, maybe that's still a bit too strong. And so now is a good point to, again, make sure that what we're doing is still getting towards the goal of what we want it to look like. And so I'm going to duplicate this viewer node with Shift D, and I'm just going to link it to our original render layer, so before all the colour correction, and I'm just going to click on it, and we can see how faded our original fire really looks compared to the composited version. So if I switch on it again, For me, this is the type of colour that I want, and so I know the compositing has been worth it. So there is one more thing that we can do, and this will be up to you. It's something you can only see when you render out the image sequence, so I do suggest doing lots of low-res tests before you do a final high-resolution render. And what it is if I can just select our fire text, it'll be animating this flame rate. The flame rate is how much fuel is added into the simulation, and it defines how hot the simulation will get, and that means how bright the render will be at the end, because if there's more fuel, there's more fire, and it's going to get hotter and brighter. So if you find that your render is getting too bright towards the middle of the animation, so if I just render this out, we'll see how bright it's looking. So this isn't actually too bad, but maybe I'm thinking this is a bit too bright for me. What I can do is say that when the text is beginning, I want it to be this strong, this flame rate, but after that I don't want it to be so strong. So I want the initial burn to be great, so it can get the simulation going. So I can insert a keyframe, and then a few frames later I can turn it down to 0.5, and this is something I did in my final one. And so throughout the simulation it's actually got a lower flame rate, and then just as we're erasing, I'll put in another keyframe, so it's constantly at 0.5 between these points, and then in a few frames it goes right down to 0, so there's no more burning. Now obviously you would have to then rebake it because we are changing simulation settings here, so I'm not actually going to do that because again it's an effect you'll only really see once you've rendered out the animation. Anyway, that is the end of the tutorial. I hope you've found it useful and maybe learned something new. If you've got any ideas for future tutorials, please leave them in the comments. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.